listening to 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry to state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Having already discussed the dangers of red flag gun confiscation laws in a previous episode of the show, today we will have as our guest award-winning gun rights writer David Codrea to discuss a recent piece he wrote for AmmoLand.com and why what gun ban advocates call universal background checks, which actually poll well even among gun owners, are actually laws for universal gun registration. It is critically important that you understand what the left is after here, since so-called universal background checks have found support among Republicans, including Donald Trump, and will almost certainly come up for debate when Congress returns in just 9 days. We'll also discuss why compromise with the political left, especially on gun control, is not possible. But before I get started, please allow me to do a quick public service announcement. With Hurricane Dorian taking a turn for what may be the coast of the Carolinas, the residents of North Carolina need to be aware of a relatively recent change in the law governing carrying firearms outside the home during declared states of emergency. Until a few years ago, you were prohibited from having dangerous substances, including firearms and ammunition, outside your home anytime there was a declared state of emergency. That, of course, denied you the ability to protect your family exactly when you needed it most, against looters and other criminals, even if you had been driven out of your home by civil unrest or a natural disaster. In fact, back in 2010, then-Governor Bev Perdue declared a statewide emergency on the opening day of dove season, making criminals of thousands of hunters. With the help of the Second Amendment Foundation and in the capable hands of attorney Alan Gura, who argued and won, by the way, both the Heller and McDonald Supreme Court decisions affirming the individual right to keep and bear arms, my organization, Grassroots North Carolina, was party to the lawsuit which struck down that restriction on Second Amendment grounds. Then we went back with considerable resistance from legislators of both political parties and completely repealed the unconstitutional ban. In sum, you may now carry firearms legally outside your home in compliance with all the usual laws, of course, even after a state of emergency has been declared. In the past few days, I apparently started a bit of a tussle on GRNC's Facebook page when I relayed a video from nationally renowned gun girl Caitlin Bennett regarding an exchange of messages she had with Congressman Dan Crenshaw, the Texas Republican who became something of a darling among conservatives, especially after his articulate rebuttal of a national comedian who lampooned his eye patch and military service. You might remember Caitlin from the viral photo of her with an AR-10 strapped on her back on the Kent State campus, demonstrating the absurdity of gun laws prohibiting her from protecting herself on campus until the day after she graduated, when openly carrying the AR became perfectly legal. She has since gone on to become a vocal and in-your-face Second Amendment activist of national note, and you may recall that in recent weeks, Dan Crenshaw caused a stir among gun rights advocates when he expressed support for red flag gun confiscation laws, by the way, have numerous rhinos like Lindsey Graham and our own Senator Thom Tillis. I would suggest you go to YouTube and search the video entitled Dan Crenshaw Messaged Me. Now, the debate got a little heated, with some even claiming I'd called Crenshaw a commie, which was not accurate. One gent maintains that Crenshaw has lots of due process protections in his proposal, unlike the Democrats. I haven't seen those, and frankly doubt that the specifics of any red flag proposal will change my mind. In truth, even Tillis is writing people who send him messages claiming he supports due process, and I quote that, prior to confiscating guns. But like most politicians, Tillis doesn't say what due process he supports. In all likelihood, he is talking about ex parte hearings in which somebody accused of being dangerous doesn't even know the hearing is taking place, much less get an opportunity to defend himself in court. To GRNC, like Gun Owners of America, that does not represent due process of law under the Fifth Amendment. Now, I posted a video and a screenshot of Crenshaw posing for a photo with the representatives of Michael Bloomberg's AstroTurf organization calling itself Moms Demand Action because I wanted to demonstrate a point. The point is that with few notable exceptions, almost nobody in Congress, or the state legislature for that matter, can be trusted regardless of claims and regardless of political affiliation. And although Crenshaw is a freshman, it has been my observation, with the thousands of politicians I've dealt with across 25 years of running gun rights organizations, that with few exceptions, the inherently corrupting process of serving in office means that you have about 2 terms before a legislator starts believing the hype, and instead of telling legislators what the people want, he starts telling you what compromise you must take. Remember that in coming weeks when Congress returns and even Republicans start talking about reasonable compromise on gun control. Now, speaking of compromise, the next item is an object lesson in how accepting the paradigms of the left can result in flawed arguments, even if they are well-intentioned and intended to argue in favor of gun rights. A frequent contributor to AmmoLand.com, Don McDougall, recently wrote a, quote, open letter to the GOP on gun control. Now, he starts out well, saying, and I quote, every time a tragedy happens, you steal a slice of our rights, a sliver here, a shaving there. The result is always the same. We lose our rights for meaningless laws that will not make anyone safer or criminals less dangerous. You sell our right as a PR stunt to win votes. Well, unfortunately, then he starts to run off the rails and says, and I quote, fine, we all accept that sometimes that needs to happen. But how about you include our needs and wants as part of your bipartisan compromise? How about us, the 120 million American gun owners, get our needs addressed? How about we cut a deal? Well, McDonald goes on to argue for easier universal background checks wherein, and I quote, any gun store or police station we can walk in and clear the transfer in 10 minutes. He calls for better red flag gun confiscation, which firearms can only be held for 60 days. Hell, with this line of argument, he will soon be mimicking the New Zealanders in complaining that the government isn't paying you enough for the semi-automatic firearms they are confiscating. Here was my response on AmmoLand. Don. How can you say the Republicans are shaving away at our rights when your own argument cedes to gun control? Only 60 days for confiscation? Well, how about if I file an extreme risk protection order and we only lock up the person subject to that order for 60 days? Would you buy off on that? Any suspension of rights relying on ex parte hearings in which the defendant doesn't even know it is occurring, much less get a chance to defend himself in court, is an unconstitutional violation of due process under the Fifth Amendment. And you propose making universal background checks easy? Sure, let's make it easy to create a central gun registry so that when the left finally gets enough votes to, in Dianne Feinstein's words, turn them all in, Mr. and Mrs. America, they know exactly where to find what they intend to confiscate. You say the Firearms Owners Protection Act and the Brady Act make it illegal to create a central registry? Sorry, buddy. It's already been done when Janet Reno refused to expunge NICS transaction records in violation of the law. But for George W. Bush and John Ashcroft, they would be doing it today. When I read your stuff, Don, I want to like you, but then you go and say something like this. Stop being an apologist for the left. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. After a short break, we will return with award-winning gun rights writer David Codrea, who writes for Firearms News and others, and his take on so-called universal background checks. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. Our guest today is David Codrea, winner of multiple journalist awards for investigating and defending the right to keep and bear arms, who has been a longtime gun rights advocate and who defiantly challenges the folly of citizen disarmament. In addition to writing for AmmoLand.com, he blogs at The War on Guns, Notes from the Resistance, is a regularly featured contributor to Firearms News, and posts at Twitter at dcodrea and Facebook. David has been on the show several times previously. Welcome back to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, David.
Paul, I'd like to say it's nice to be here, but it seems every time we get together, it's because people are trying to do things to us.
Imagine that. Yeah, of course, that does describe most of the 21st century, and the 20th for that matter. But anyways, all right. Last week, I was reading your excellent piece in AmmoLand.com entitled Gun Grabber Gripes about ATF Tracing, a Feint for Gun Registration and More. Basically, I would like to pursue two tacks on this. The first will be what's at issue with gun control organizations constantly trying to get gun tracing data from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And more than that, given that Congress will be returning in slightly over a week, and that not only the Democrat-controlled House, but also the Republican-led Senate has promised to look at more gun control. I'd like to discuss what at face value is a concept that seems to poll well, even among gun owners who don't necessarily consider all of the implications, namely that so-called universal background checks mean basically universal gun registration. So, David, ATF tracing data, why don't you explain a little bit what's at issue here?
Sure. Well, the piece that you referred to was basically spurred by an Atlantic piece that was doing a pity party for ATF because they have to go through trace records manually and they don't have a database to go through. But the whole issue of ATF firearms tracing, rather than me tell you, let's let ATF tell us all. They say that firearms tracing is the systematic tracking of the movement of firearm recovered by law enforcement officials from its first sale by the manufacturer or importer through the distribution chain, which means wholesaler and retailer, to the first retail purchaser. Okay? So this is basically the data set that we're limited in, that a law enforcement request has to be made, and they can take it, this was made by Smith & Wesson, and it was sold by Joe's Gun Shop, and the retail purchaser was Paul Vallone. Okay, that's
so
what it
why do
tells
they
you.
want this stuff, though? I mean, what exactly is the gun ban movement trying to do with this data?
Well, the gun ban movement is trying to, first of all, deflate an appropriations amendment that keeps the firearms records from being mechanized and put into a searchable database so that they can find out who all gun owners are based on their purchases from FFLs. And then, of course, if you combine this with the move towards the so-called universal background check, And what they hope to do is they hope to get everyone. They hope to have the private sales have to go through an FFL for being recorded, and they hope to have everybody wrapped up. And, of course, I think we can all see just by hearing this little scheme what the big weakness is, and that is, the people who are going to work outside the system.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about universal background checks in the next segment, what that really means. But a number of years ago, when the gun ban advocates actually got hold of some of the tracing data, I believe it was pursuant to litigation, at the time they were screaming for mandatory gun tracing and claiming there was a so-called iron pipeline of guns being trafficked from states with fewer restrictions to states with more stringent gun control. Now, ignoring for a moment that the gun ban advocates never really explained why these trafficked guns never seem to create the sort of problems in the states they're trafficked from, which have lots of guns, as they do to the states they're being trafficked to, where guns are supposedly prohibited. But never mind all that. The interesting thing is that they branded guns traced as crime guns. And so they want information on crime guns, they say. Is that necessarily true? Are guns traced necessarily crime guns?
No, and this pipeline is awful clogged because the average time to crime is something like 9.3 years. But no, and ATF even has a disclaimer. Okay, they put out state reports that shows their activities throughout all the various states, and they always put a big caveat right up in the front section that says not all firearms used in crime are traced, and not all firearms traced are used in crime. And you can well see, look, if the system is predicated on I'm a cop, I come into the crime scene, I find a gun, I record the information about it, and I call the ATF tracing center, and I give you the information. Just because the gun happened to be at a scene doesn't mean that it had anything to do with it, so it's not necessarily a crime gun.
As a perfect example, I once had a gun traced at a traffic stop. Okay, is that a crime gun? Of course not. So basically, they're trying to inflate the data to support the case for gun control by inflating the number of so-called crime guns. Now, one of their biggest lies was that, and I quote, the primary source of illegal guns is corrupt or rogue gun dealers. Is that true, David? Do criminals really get guns from rogue dealers?
No, as a matter of fact, they don't really have a firm fixed line on how criminals get guns. The best that they can do is they can approximate, and they do that through surveys. The most recent one that I'm aware of is the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's a 2016 survey of prison inmates. And a quote direct from that report says an estimated 287,400 prisoners had possessed a firearm during their offense. Among these, more than half, which is 56%, had either stolen it, found it at the scene, or obtained it off the street from the underground market. Most of the remainder had obtained it from a family member or friend or as a gift. 7% had purchased it under their own name from a licensed firearm dealer.
That's I have the older copy of that report. I'm glad you brought the updated version of that up because, frankly, that buttresses our point even more. But, of course, because every gun control needs a villain, one prominent gun control advocate claimed, and I quote, and this is, I won't name the gun dealer, but one of the large gun dealers in the state was named by the ATF as the fifth worst store in supplying guns in crimes nationwide. The amazing thing is the BATF said nothing of the sort. At the time, I spoke to ATF spokesman Earl Woodham, and he said they don't even keep such lists. The gun dealer in question is one of the largest in the country. They've been in business for nearly 60 years, and were at a similarly successful auto dealer. Wouldn't you expect more cars it sold to be involved in accidents? I mean, the idea that these are rogue dealers are ridiculous. The fact is, everybody's following the background check rules.
Yeah, and this is all part of another move that they're doing to shame manufacturers, to shame dealers, to shame gun owners. Okay, this is all part of it because what they really want is they want nobody to have a gun, and we have all these little bills come up. And what people don't understand and what Republicans need to understand is, you know what, you give them this incremental step and they're going to be back tomorrow saying you never compromise on anything and they want something else because we know what the end game is. The end game is the slippery slope to where nobody has a gun except the government.
And I think the thing I need to emphasize to people all the time, people on our side, is they figure, well, we can compromise with them and maybe they'll go away. For example, the Toomey Manchin compromise for universal background checks in 2013. I'm sure you remember that. And the idea was we'll give them background checks light and they won't be back for more. Do you think that would have worked?
Imagine you're out in the wilderness and you're surrounded by a pack of circling, starving jackals. And you've got a lunchbox with you and you've got a sandwich in there. So why don't you take that sandwich out and toss it to the jackals? Do you think they're going to go away? Or do you think that's going to embolden them that there is food here and we better come in closer and see what else we can rip out?
I want you to know, speaking of ripping, I'm going to rip that off at some point. I'm going to plagiarize that. That is that's a great metaphor. Yeah, count on it. All right, we're going to have to take a break in a moment here. When we come back, what I'd like to talk about is universal background checks, because, of course, this is going to be a big issue when Congress comes back in September. I think it's September 10th or 9th. 9th, I think it is. And even Donald Trump has expressed support for these so-called universal background checks. So this could be a big issue for us. But right now we're going to take a break. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. We will return in just a moment with David Codrea and still more information better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7 WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. Our guest today is award-winning gun rights author David Codrea. Given recent mass shootings, the push is once again on for gun control in Congress, with even Republicans speaking fondly of both red flag, gun confiscation laws, and so-called universal background checks. Initially, Donald Trump supported changes to gun purchase background checks. As a matter of fact, Fox News said, and I quote, Trump said he has spoken to McConnell, and he is convinced the Senate Majority Leader wants to move forward on a universal background check bill. The piece quoted Trump as saying, I believe that Mitch and I can tell you from my standpoint, I would like to see meaningful background checks, whatever that means. But Trump got lots of negative input from gun-owning voters, and several news outlets have speculated he is backing off background check proposals. But most recently, Trump pushed back on the claims that he told the NRA that background checks were off the table, and he's now saying, quote, I have an appetite for background checks. We're going to be doing background checks. We're going to be filling in some of the loopholes. Now, I don't know where Trump really stands on that. He's kind of all over the map, but I do know the issue is attractive to even some gun owners who don't fully understand that expanded background checks on all sales would mean potentially universal gun registration. Right now, 83% of gun owners support that, and 72% of NRA members, at least according to the public policy polling survey. So where Trump stands is anybody's guess, but two things are assured. First, that Congress will take up the issue when it returns on September 9th, and second, that the media and gun control organizations will be pushing hot and heavy for gun control of any kind. So, David, the idea of keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally unstable sounds laudable enough, but when the gun control organizations scream for universal background checks, what are they really talking about?
Well, don't take my word for it. Take the word of Greg Ridgway. And Greg Ridgway is the Deputy Director for the National Institute of Justice. He did a 2013 Department of Justice report called Summary of Select Firearm Violence Prevention Strategies. And a quote from him is, the effectiveness of universal background checks depends on the ability to reduce straw purchasing requiring registration. Boom.
Oh, heavens.
Okay. Yeah, and this is, so this is not some gun freak that's claiming that the sky is falling. I'm giving you, this is the National Institute of Justice, and make of that what you will. I have to say that whenever I hear anybody say, well, 74% of NRA members agree, forgive me if I don't particularly give that a lot of credibility. How do you know? What is your proof that you've got 74% of NRA members agreeing on something like this? Because the lists aren't out. Thank goodness. Maybe someday the registration will require that too.
Well, I think if you were to phrase the question differently and ask the NRA members if they would support universal gun registration, the answer would be a resounding no. But, of course, they don't necessarily understand that background checks, as the opposition defines them, mean gun registration. The biggest issue here, I guess, is some of the states have done this on ballot initiatives, thanks to Michael Bloomberg, but basically running private gun sales or private transfers through the National Instant Background Check System. Isn't that exactly what they're looking for here?
They're not going to catch, first of all, the bad guys, which is what Governor Kate Brown said when SB 941 passed in Oregon. She said it's an important step to keep guns out of hands of criminals whom the laws determine should not have them. And, remember that prison survey that we just talked about, okay? They do not get them off of dealers. They steal them. They get them through the black market. They get them in other places. And there was an interesting story. One of the Oregon representatives talked about an anti-gun pastor who won an AR-15 in a raffle, and he was going to melt it down and make it into art. But before he was going to do that, he didn't want to keep it at home, so he gave it to a trusted friend with a gun safe so that he could keep it for him. But they didn't do a background check, so this idiot broke the law. And then of course, he doubled down saying, well, it's nobody's business where the gun is. Well, what's the whole point of what you guys are talking about, moron? Okay?
I love it when the left gets some of their own. Don't you enjoy that? I think the Germans call that shot, right?
Yeah, and then of course in Nevada, Bloomberg spent something like $20 million. The $20 million came from John Lott, the Crime Prevention Research Center, and basically they passed this question one in Nevada, where Clark County, the populous county, overwhelms all the other counties which voted against it. And it turns out that the Bloomberg's lawyers were incompetent at drafting the bill because the act specifically directs the dealer to run checks directly through the FBI's NICS system, and the Nevada Department of Public Safety has no authority to perform the private party background checks required by the act. So they wanted people doing the checks that weren't authorized by federal law to do it. So the FBI says, well, we can't do this for you. And the Attorney General of the state of Nevada says, well, sorry, we can't enforce this for you because, the FBI says no.
You bring up an interesting point, though, particularly when you were talking about the anti-gun preacher earlier. What exactly, when he transferred somebody, now normally we think of a transfer as being a sale, okay? Is that all they're really after here? What constitutes a transfer under one of these typical background check laws?
Well, there's a couple different legal, ways to do transfers. One is through an FFL who's going to use NICS, and then the FFL is going to have rules of his own. For instance, you can purchase a long gun in any state so long as the sale mirrors the policy.
My point is that under most of these laws, if you were to hand somebody a firearm at a range for them to check out, you have committed a transfer. And at least under Oregon's law, I believe that's the case. And you actually have to go do one of these background checks, go to a dealer and do a transfer just to literally hand somebody else a firearm, or to inherit a firearm, or to gift a firearm to your son. Okay, we're not just talking about sales between strangers. We're talking about family members. Isn't that right?
Yeah, or if you want to give someone to a gun for safekeeping, okay, just on a temporary basis. You can't go ahead and do that without going through this bureaucratic transfer process. And then to get the gun back, you have to do a reverse transfer. I mean, this can even extend to, say you need your gun taken in for repair. and you need a gunsmith to work on it. How do you get it to the gunsmith, and then how do you get it back from the gunsmith? And it's just all a bunch of bureaucratic nonsense, and what we have to remember is that the one group that is not going to do any of this is the very group people say this is necessary to stop, the criminal class. They're not going to do any of this, okay? It's ridiculous. The only people that this affects are the people who are inclined to obey the law, and what this does is this harasses the hell out of them to where they just want to toss up their hands and say, this whole thing isn't worth it.
Precisely the point. Make gun ownership as difficult as possible so that you reduce the number of people who actually bother to jump through all the hoops, so that ultimately when you ban firearms, fewer people will care. That, of course, is exactly the goal of the incremental approach to banning firearms. Now, I think you mentioned it before, but let's reiterate this. Why exactly do these gun ban advocates want these universal background check laws? What's the primary reason for making sure that all this stuff goes through the National Instant Check system?
They want registration, they want a trackable database, and they want that so that when they enact further laws, red flags, whatever, a magazine ban, quote-unquote assault weapons ban, they have a list of who has what so that they can go after it.
Exactly, and I'll talk about it more in the final segment of the show, but the bottom line is you cannot ban what you cannot find. Now, anybody that says that the National Instant Check system cannot be used for gun registration should know that it already has been under the Clinton administration. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but the bottom line is that even though the Brady Act and the Firearms Owners Protection Act of 1986, even though both of those theoretically ban registration of firearms, it's already been tried once. So we'll talk more about that shortly. David, very pleasant talking to you again. I thank you for joining us and helping inform the listeners on why universal background checks, as they are defined, are a threat to gun ownership. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, there's just 3 words to remember, and that's from Loretta Weinberg and Sandy Cunningham and Linda Greenstein of the Democrat State Senate in New Jersey. They were overheard on the microphone after a session saying, we need a bill that was going to confiscate.
Ah, yes, indeed. Confiscate. All right. Folks, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with more information, better enabling you to defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In our last segment, we were discussing the implications of so-called universal background checks, for which even Donald Trump has expressed support, and which will likely be considered when Congress reconvenes on September 9th. Our guest was award-winning gun rights writer David Codrea, who writes for Firearms News, AmmoLand.com, and others. Now, you can keep up with all of David Codrea's work at waronguns.com. That's waronguns.com. Continuing on the subject of universal background checks, I prefer to call this proposal universal gun registration, and here is why. I once had the opportunity to have dinner with noted criminologist Gary Kleck of Florida State University. Now, if you don't recognize that name, you probably do recognize his research, which found that contrary to previous estimates, guns are used in self-defense up to 2.5 million times per year, and that in a majority of those cases, the guns are not actually fired. His book is Point Blank: Guns and Violence in America. What most people don't realize is that Gary Kleck is a liberal, and that he actually supports some gun control. Moreover, since our dinner occurred shortly after the 2013 federal gun control bill for universal background checks failed, background checks were the primary topic of our conversation. Kleck actually supports universal background checks. I, on the other hand, argued that he should oppose them because absolutely nobody could design a universal background check system that could not be turned into a gun registration system. What Kleck argued, and what most people don't realize, is that the federal government is, at least in theory, prohibited from registering guns under both the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act and also under the 1994 Brady Act. Says legal scholar David Kopel of the Independence Institute, and I quote, "When the NICS law was enacted in November 1993, Section 103I2 made it clear that the names of firearms purchasers were not to be retained in the system. Quote, no department, agency, officer, or employee of the United States may use the system established under this section to establish any system for the registration of firearms or firearms owners." The same prohibition against federal gun registration also appears in the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act. Regardless, after the National Instant Background Check System, or NICS, was created, Bill Clinton's Attorney General, Janet Reno, announced that the FBI would be retaining the transaction records they were supposed to destroy in 24 hours, a clear violation of the Brady Act. The NRA sued, but lost the suit when, as David Kopel describes, quote, Judges David S. Tatel and Merrick B. Garland, both Clinton appointees, maintained that federal law, quote, does not prohibit all forms of registration. Actually, the federal statute specifically bans any registration. And yes, by the way, that tortured language came from Merrick Garland, the judge that Barack Obama tried unsuccessfully to appoint to the Supreme Court. Kopel also said, and I quote, in arguing that FBI retention of information does not constitute registration, the two Clinton-appointed judges noted that the FBI list does not contain the names of every U.S. gun owner, and that the retention of names was not intended to be permanent. These arguments ignore the obvious fact that partial or temporary registration is still a, quote, system of registration. The practice of illegally retaining NICS records was only reversed after the election of George W. Bush and the appointment of John Ashcroft as Attorney General. So the bottom line is this. If anybody tells you that NICS can't be a gun registration system, tell them it already has been. It's already been done once. For those prone to compromise on the gun control, which will be considered in Congress in 9 days, I would like to close the show today by discussing such compromise. At the beginning of the show, I cited an ostensibly pro-gun writer who accused Republicans of selling us out, but then went on to call for easier gun registration and red flag confiscation laws that only confiscate guns for 60 days. In a twist on Oliver Hazard Perry's words after a famous naval battle, namely, we have met the enemy and he is ours, Walt Kelly, writing the comic strip Pogo, said it best. We have met the enemy and he is us. A regular series on AmmoLand.com is called The Arbalist Quarrel, which title, I believe, refers to a superior crossbow developed in the 12th century. The piece is entitled, The Right of the People to Keep and Bear Arms is Completely at Odds with Collectivism. It's a long piece, but allow me to read a couple of excerpts. And I quote, The ethical systems and political philosophies of individualists and collectivists are mutually exclusive and therefore cannot be reconciled with each other. We see two different value systems of two distinct political and social philosophies, one reflecting the tenets of individualism and the other reflecting the tenets of collectivism. Each side frames the political, social, and ethical questions in mutually exclusive ways, as each side emphasizes different values, and this in turn is reflected in the policy choices each side makes, as that side attempts to resolve what it perceives as a distinct political, social, and ethical problems and dilemmas. Thus we see each side taking different policy positions on every major issue, three of the salient pressing ones of late being firearms, abortion, and immigration. But why is that? Why are there such profound differences on social and political issues, such profound differences that each side doesn't even ask the same questions, approaching the issues in such different veins that it is impossible for each side even to begin to understand the other side? It is as if each side is speaking a different language. And this being so, it stands to reason that resolution of political and social views would reflect demonstrably distinct antithetical policy choices that make reconciliation between the two sides impossible. It is for this reason that there can be no compromise, no negotiation between the two sides, as any attempt to do so would be sterile, empty, as one side seeks to preserve the philosophical underpinnings upon which this nation was created, the free republic the founders placed their very lives on the line to create and to provide for future generations of Americans, and the other side seeks to rend and replace the nation the founders created. These radical leftists and progressives desire to erase the very memory of our nation as it is, and once was and is ever to be. They seek to wipe the slate clean to start over, to replace a free republic and a free people with a thing that died long ago and that should have remained dead and buried long ago, the Marxist, collectivist, dystopian dream of a one-world, borderless, political, social, economic construct, ruled by an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful government. This is the collectivist nightmare of a world devoid of nations, devoid of free citizens, devoid of hope, dreams, and reason, a world containing serfs, drones, and slaves, all controlled by a small cadre of ruthless overseers intent on containing, constricting dissent, and bending entire populations to their will, the goal of which is to provide uniformity in thought and conduct, along with confounding oppressive stasis. Think about that the next time somebody says we should compromise on gun control. So in coming weeks, you will hear well-intentioned idiots tell you should compromise on gun control, advancing in compromise. And I want to leave you, I guess, with the words of objectivist philosopher Ayn Rand and what she had to say about compromise. And I quote, "In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit. In that transfusion of blood which drains the good to feed the evil, the compromiser is the transmitting rubber tube." My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, HyattGuns.com. I also encourage you to check my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, spell out that and, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, where you can find my writings and earlier editions of the show. See you next Sunday at 5.